Your Eminence, Cardinal George Pell, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Global Warming Policy Foundation's second annual lecture. It's my particular honor to welcome His Eminence, Cardinal Pell, the Archbishop of Sydney, and his distinguished guests, and allow me also to extend a word of welcome to the ambassadors and diplomats from more than a dozen nations. Ladies and gentlemen, the climate debate is much more than just a battle over scientific theories and environmental statistics. At its core, it's a question of which approach our societies should take in view of a serious concern that could possibly turn out to be a real problem sometime in the future. What rational societies and policymakers need to ask is, what are the most reasonable and the most cost-effective policies that neither ignore a potential problem that may possibly materialize in the distant future, nor the actual economic costs of such policies here and now? Fundamentally, these are social, ethical, and economic questions that cannot be answered by science alone, but require careful consideration by economists and social commentators. Because climate policies are having a detrimental impact on many families, not least the poorest in societies, we should listen carefully to the social and ethical concerns raised by Cardinal Pell. After all, it is the poor who are paying the price for expensive green energy policies. Heating and electricity bills are going up, and fuel poverty is increasing in the name of saving the planet. It's quite apparent that over the last 12 months there has been a huge public backlash against these unpopular policies, in particular in Britain, but also in other countries. Instead of using the cheapest form of energy, which would help the poorest who are increasingly struggling to pay their bills, the government is forcing us to subsidize highly expensive green energy. Ever since we launched the Global Warming Policy Foundation 2 years ago, we've argued that Britain's unilateral climate policy is indefensible, both socially and economically, and that it should be suspended in the absence of an international agreement. Today, our realistic concern and assessment has finally been acknowledged by the government. In fact, the Chancellor, George Osborne, has recently promised that Britain will no longer be bound by unilateral policies that cut CO2 emissions in Britain faster and deeper than other countries in Europe. We certainly welcome the government's new realism, which in many ways reflects the public's growing skepticism. This change in public mood is likely to have other consequences too. In this week's issue of the Church Times, the weekly journal of the Church of England, Peter Forster, the Bishop of Chester and one of our trustees, and who I'm happy to say is with us tonight in the audience, wrote, "The churches have tended to follow climate alarmism with uncritical enthusiasm, but it is now time to take stock. The moral issues surrounding climate policies, as well as the underlying scientific and economic issues, are much more complex than is usually acknowledged. It is time for the churches to recognize this and to lead a debate which helps our society to a more sensible set of policies." End of quote. I believe that nobody has done more to raise these awkward questions within the Catholic Church than Cardinal Pell. It is an irony of our bewildering times that it is a courageous churchman who dares to question one of our society's most entrenched dogmas. But that is exactly what he will do tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, His Eminence, Cardinal George Pell.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking the Global Warming Policy Foundation for the invitation to deliver this lecture. It came as a surprise, and I truly appreciate the honour. However, I'm more grateful for the existence of the Foundation and its sane and important contributions in this debate. A word or two about the structure of the talk, because I examine the issue from a number of different directions. They reflect what little expertise I have. The central part discusses the scientific claims and demonstrates, I hope, that a scientific layman can cover and identify the basic issues. After a brief theological introduction, I explain why I chose to write on global warming, while the central section is followed by a brief discussion of the propaganda wars, a longer discourse on the existence of the medieval warm period, and concludes with some public policy questions and reflections which have been anticipated. In the book of Genesis, we read that God regretted having made human beings, such was their wickedness and anarchy, and decided to send an immense flood to destroy them and the earth. However, God chose Noah, an upright man, to build an ark and enter it with his wife and family and 2 animals of every kind. The ark survived the flood, and Noah was commanded to breed, multiply, and fill the earth, reassured by God's promise that never again shall all living beings be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Many generations later, when the whole world spoke the same language, the descendants of Noah on the Babylonian plains decided to build a city and a tower with its top reaching heaven in order to make a name for themselves. God, however, was displeased by their ambitions, so he intervened to destroy their linguistic unity, and they couldn't understand one another. This unsuccessful tower was called Babel. So we have the Ark or the Tower of Babel as alternative symbols of our attempts to survive or perhaps escape from our natural predicaments. Leon Kass is a brilliant and controversial polymath, recently retired from the University of Chicago. He's written a fascinating book, a remarkable book, I think, on the book of Genesis entitled The Beginning of Wisdom. And I want to quote briefly from his understanding of the Tower of Babel. Kass sees God's intervention as only highlighting the inevitable failure of an attempt to impose a single world view, the all-too-human, prideful attempt at self-creation, and sees the emerging differences and opposition implied in the diversity of language and migration to different lands as the key to the discovery of the distinction between truth and error, appearance and reality, convention and nature, as I do. Not surprisingly, Kass believes that in today's Western world, the project of Babel has been making a comeback. Science and technology are again in the ascendancy, defying political boundaries en route to a projected human imperium over nature. Kass asks, can our Babel succeed? We should ask whether our attempts at global climate control are within human capacity, that is, the projected human imperium, or, on the other hand, are likely to be as misdirected and ineffective as the construction of the famous tower in the temple of Marduk, Babylon's chief god. Science and technology have already achieved considerable mastery over nature and massive local achievements. But where is the borderline separating us from what is beyond human power? Where does scientific striving become uneconomic, immoral, or ineffectual, and so lapse into hubris? Have scientists been co-opted onto a bigger, better advertised and more expensive bandwagon than the Millennium Bug fiasco? Why might a Catholic bishop comment? We might ask whether my skepticism is yet another example of religious ignorance and intransigence, opposing the forward progress of science, as is alleged in the confrontations between Galileo and the papacy in the early 17th century, when the church party on the evidence of Scripture insisted that the sun moved around the earth. Or the almost equally celebrated debate between Bishop Wilberforce, Soapy Sam, and T.H. Huxley in 1860 at Oxford on the topic of Darwinian evolution, when the claim was made that man made in God's image was seen as contradicting evolution. Galileo's house arrest is comfortable as it was, is indefensible. And Pope John Paul II has acknowledged the suffering he endured from his church, although Galileo's provocative claims on theology sharpened the tension. John Paul II acknowledged that the error of the theologians of the time, when they maintained the centrality of the earth, was to think that our understanding of the world's structure was in some way imposed by the literal sense of sacred scripture. The Oxford debate has also expanded into legend. Darwin himself conceded that Wilberforce's 18,000-word review of the origin of the species was uncommonly clever and made a very telling case against me. Even some of the committed Darwinians of the debate thought that it was a draw. There's no contemporary evidence to show that Wilberforce actually asked his notorious question to Huxley about his simian ancestry on his grandmother's or his grandfather's side. But the question, real or fictitious, has been a propaganda boon for the anti-religious forces for decades. At a recent meeting of the Priests' Council in Sydney, one parish priest asked me why I was commenting publicly on the role of carbon dioxide in the climate, because in the past the Church had made a fool of herself on a number of occasions on similar issues. I replied that I was aware of at least some of these instances, and that one reason why I was speaking out was to avoid having too many Christian leaders repeating these mistakes, and to provide some balance to ecclesiastical offerings. I first became interested in the question in the 1990s when studying the anti-human claims of the deep greens, one of whom said he'd prefer to shoot a man rather than a snake. So I had long suspected that those predicting dangerous and increasing anthropogenic global warming were overstating their case. During the years 2008 and 9, it was dangerous for an Australian politician to voice dissent unless he was from a country electorate. Opponents were silenced. As I wasn't up for re-election, and I suspected the Emperor had very few of any clothes, I made a few more small public statements, never from the pulpit, never at a large public meeting. What the science says. Recently, Robert Mann, a prominent Australian social commentator, following fashionable opinion, wrote, and I quote, that the science is truly settled on the fundamental theory of climate change, namely, global warming is happening. It's primarily caused by the emission of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, and it's certain to have profound effects in the future. These fundamentals are distinct, he acknowledged, from scores of other different questions. The author is secure in these fundamentals, dismayed and embarrassed by those who cannot make these distinctions, especially, as he said, the future of the earth and of humanity are at stake. He accused opponents of ideological prejudice and intellectual muddle. His appeal is to the consensual view among qualified scientists. The consensual view among qualified scientists. I think this is a fundamental error. It's a category mistake, scientifically and philosophically. And it's also often a cop-out, a way of avoiding the basic issues. What is important and what needs to be examined by lay people as well as scientists is the evidence and argumentation which are reduced to back any consensus. The basic issue is not whether the science is settled, but whether the explanation and evidence are adequate in that paradigm. I suspect that many educated people are like the insurance brokers working in this area, whom I heard of recently, who confessed that they'd never even begun to examine the evidence for themselves. And I fear, too, that many politicians have never investigated the primary evidence. Now, I'm happy to concede that much is opaque to non-specialists like myself, but persistent inquiry and study can produce useful clarifications, similar to the 9 errors identified by the British High Court in Al Gore's propaganda film, An Inconvenient Truth. And that was a very cautious judgment. I've read it. The complacent appeal to scientific consensus is simply one more appeal to authority, which is quite inappropriate in science and philosophy. Thomas Aquinas pointed this out long ago, explaining that the argument from authority based on human reason is the weakest form of argument in philosophy and science. And it's all because it's always liable to logical refutation. Underlying these models, we have a fundamental scientific problem, which has been usefully set out by Lord Monckton, quoting Edward Lorenz, the founder of chaos theory. In 1963, Lorenz wrote that in the instability of a non-periodic flow, and evolution is ostensibly aperiodic, prediction of the sufficiently distant future is impossible by any method unless the present conditions are known exactly. Lorenz continued that in view of the inevitable inaccuracy and incompleteness of weather observations, precise, very long-range weather forecasting would seem to be non-existent, because our knowledge both of the initial state of the climate system and of how the climate responds to changes in external forces is incomplete. Now, it's not generally realised that in 2001 at least one of the IPCC third assessment report's working groups agreed with this. And I quote, "In climate research and modelling, we are dealing with a coupled, non-linear, chaotic system, and therefore that the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible." Note that it's not just the weather, but also future climate states that are not reliably predictable in the long term. As Mark Twain said, climate is what you expect and the weather is what you get. Neither is predictable. For Australians, Professor Bob Carter, Dr. David Evans, Professor Stuart Franks and Dr. William Kinnenmonth have succinctly stated the case for the sceptics, a case which has so far been completely ignored by the Australian media and political class. It was published in a series of articles in Quadrant, which is the leading centre, right-of-centre periodical in Australia. The conclusions of the 2007 Fourth Assessment Report of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they wrote, are essentially reliant on computer modelling and lack empirical support. Its speculations on the baleful influence of atmospheric carbon dioxide rest almost exclusively on unvalidated computer modelling that rests on unsubstantiated assumptions about the amplification effects of water vapour, clouds and other unverifiable factors. And then they pointed out, I think with complete accuracy, the predictions based on these methods have been wrong for the last 23 years. During the decade since 2001, carbon dioxide has increased by 5%, but the atmosphere has failed to warm. The influence of various solar mechanisms such as sunspot activity and changing ocean circulation, which are poorly understood, are omitted from the climate models, as is the influence of major volcanoes such as the occasional mighty eruption, Krakatoa or Mount St Helens, or the continuing eruptions deep in the ocean, which have been brought to public attention by Professor Ian Plimer. While causal physical principles such as the greenhouse effect are known, much else hasn't been established definitively. Such uncertainties include the already mentioned water vapour multipliers, sunspot activities and cloud formation, as well as deforestation, soil carbon and aerosols. And we should also add variations of the Earth's orbital parameters, asteroid and comet impacts, and variations in cosmic rays, where there's been some recent developments in CERN in Switzerland. Claims of atmospheric warming often appear to conflict and depend critically upon the period of time under consideration. For For example, the Earth has cooled over the last 10,000 years. It's cooled over the last 1,000 years. It's warmed over the last 400 years. Global temperature reached a 20th century high in 1998, corresponding to the strong El Niño episode of that year. And subsequently, the continued warming anticipated by the IPCC did not eventuate. And after first reaching a plateau, by 2010, temperature had cooled slightly. The failure to warm was accompanied by dominant La Niña conditions and by a period of solar sunspot quietude. The following facts are additional reasons for skepticism. Multiple lines of evidence show that in many places, most of the 11,700 years since the end of the last ice age were warmer than the present by up to 2 degrees Celsius. The ice core records of the cycles of glacial and interglacial periods of the last 1 million years or so do show a correlation between carbon dioxide levels and the temperature. But the changes in temperature preceded the changes in carbon dioxide and cannot therefore have been caused by them. Carbon dioxide was probably outgassed from the warming oceans and vice versa when they cooled. Finally, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide is generally the same everywhere, but temperature changes are not the same everywhere. The battle for public opinion. As a bishop who regularly preaches to congregations of every age and at widely different levels of education and prosperity, I have some experience of the challenges in presenting a point of view to the general public. This helps me to understand the propaganda achievements of the climate extremists, at least until their attempted elimination of the medieval warming and then ClimateGate. And I wasn't surprised to learn that the IPCC used some of the world's best advertising agencies to generate maximum effect among the public. Since climate has been changing, as Professor Clymer, the outspoken Australian scientist, ever since, as he put it, that first Thursday, 4,567 million years ago, when the Earth began and the atmosphere began to form, I'm not a denier of climate change. And I'm not sure whether any such person still exists or did exist. Therefore, the term climate change denier, however expedient as an insult or propaganda weapon, with its deliberate overtones of comparison with the Holocaust denial, is not a useful description of any significant participant in the discussion. First of all, at least in Australia in the 1990s, we were warned about the greenhouse effect. And then it slipped over, the warning was against global warming. The next retreat was to anthropogenic global warming, or AGW. Then, more generically, we were called to cope with the challenge of climate change. Then it became apparent that the climate is changing no more now than it did in the past, and seamlessly the claim shifted to anthropogenic climate disruption. These redefinitions have captured the discourse. Who would want to be denounced and caricatured as a denier? Another more spectacular example of this successful spin is the debate on carbon footprints, on the advisability or not of a carbon tax. We all know that it's the role of carbon dioxide in climate change which is in question, not the role of carbon, but we continue to talk about carbon. The public discussion is almost entirely conducted in terms of carbon footprints and a carbon tax, provoking colourful but misconceived images of carcinogenic burnt toast and narrow Dickensian chimneys being cleaned by unhealthy young chimney sweeps. It's brilliant advertising, but it's untrue. My suspicions have been deepened over the years by the climate movement's totalitarian approach to opposing views, their demonising of successful opponents, and their opposition to the publication of opposing views even in scientific journals. As a general rule, I've found that those secure in their explanations don't need to be abusive. Churchill claimed that in wartime, and I quote, "Truth is so precious, she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." He was talking about Operation Overlord, the landings in Normandy, and he made the remark to Stalin, who naturally was delighted. But this sort of approach should be anathematized in science. Another, not fantastically important, but useful fact, I've discovered that very few people know how small the percentage of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere during the 20th century are estimated to have risen from 280 parts per million to 390 parts per million, an increase of 40%. So yet today's total carbon dioxide concentration represents less than 1/25 of 1% of the atmosphere. While opinions vary, one geochemist has calculated that only about 5% of present atmospheric carbon dioxide is derived from burning fossil fuels, 5% worldwide. Just over 1% of that comes from Australia, and that's another story. I can understand why the IPCC public relations advisors didn't ensure that these statistics were presented vividly to the public, because they're no stimulus to alarm. In fact, they seem to be a well-kept secret outside scientific circles. Despite the fact that Wikipedia's entry on air pollution now includes carbon dioxide emissions in a list of greenhouse gas pollutants, carbon dioxide does not destroy the purity of the atmosphere or make it foul or filthy, which is the Oxford Dictionary definition of a pollutant. It's not a pollutant, but part of the stuff of life. Animals wouldn't notice a doubling of carbon dioxide, and plants would love it and would thrive on it. It's alleged that Californian orange groves are now 30% more productive than 150 years ago, possibly because of the extra CO2. In another direction, humans would feel no adverse effects unless carbon dioxide concentration rose to at least 5,000 parts per million, or almost 13 times today's concentration, far beyond any likely future atmospheric levels. A final point to be noted in this struggle to convince public opinion is that the language used by AGW proponents veers towards that of primitive religious controversy. Believers are contrasted with deniers, doubters, and skeptics, although I must confess that no one has dubbed me a climate change heretic. The rewards, even amongst the proponents, for proper environmental behaviour are uncertain. Tim Flannery, a leading exponent in Australia, said, "Nothing we can do will improve the situation. We might be able to prevent it getting worse." But the grim scenarios for the future, as a result of human irresponsibility, have a dash of the apocalyptic about them, even of the horsemen of the apocalypse. The immense financial costs true believers would impose on economies can be compared with the sacrifices offered traditionally in religion, and the sale of carbon credits with the pre-Reformation practice of selling indulgences. Some of those campaigning to save the planet are not merely zealous, but zealots. To the religionless and spiritually rootless, the mythology, whether comforting or discomforting, can be magnetically, even pathogenically attractive. History, or more than anecdotes. Remember Canute. The history of climate change provides no reassurance that human activity can control or even substantially modify the global climate, although humans can affect important local changes for good or ill. In broad outline, the history is uncontroversial. For 2.5 million years, northern Eurasia and North America were covered by ice sheets kilometres deep. and the Earth has seen 11 strong glacial episodes or ice ages in the past 1 million years. We live in an interglacial period which has now lasted 10,000 to 11,500 years. The warmer interglacials usually last between 10,000 to 20,000 years, occurring at intervals of about 100,000 years. By these criteria, one could argue that an ice age is now overdue, which perhaps contributed to the cooling scare, which was quite pervasive in the 1970s. Even one or two scientists participated in that and are now participating in the warming scare. Apparently, the present eccentricity of the Earth's orbit is small, decreasing, and likely to continue for 30,000 years, meaning that our current interglacial may be exceptionally prolonged. So let's hope so. Controversies commence as we approach the Christian era, as nobody seems too concerned about the Minoan warming of about 3,500 years ago. The Roman warming around 2,000 years ago provoked some heartburn, while we have seen attempts to erase the medieval warm period from about 850 to 1250, 1300 from history. On February the 7th, 2010, I had published a small piece on climate change in my weekly column of Sydney's Sunday Telegraph, which raised some of the issues I've discussed earlier. This was referred by Senator Ian MacDonald at the Senate Estimates Committee of the Australian Parliament. This was referred by him to the Bureau of Meteorology for comment, which was duly provided. They accepted most of what I claimed, but objected to 3 particular facts. On February the 21st, 2011, Dr. Greg Ayers, the Director of Meteorology, was granted leave to appear before the committee to respond to my article and letter. His contribution was unusual, primarily for his diatribe against Professor Ian Plimer and his book, Heaven and Earth, Global Warming, The Missing Science, 30,000 copies of which were sold in Australia in a few months. But Ayers denounced it as simply not scientific, misleading to all Australians, pseudoscience, and a polemic. It was unusual. Dr. Ayers provided detailed responses on a number of issues, but a major topic was his defence of the Bureau's claim that temperatures in recent decades have been warmer than those of the Middle Ages. The first and second IPCC assessment reports had shown a medieval warm period, warmer than the end of the 20th century, and followed by a little ice age. Notoriously, both the medieval warm period and the little ice age were eliminated in the 2001 third assessment report, following Michael Mann's 1999 study on the last 1,000 years of climate. 2 Canadians and academics, Stephen McIntyre and Professor Ross McKittrick, found Mann's data misleading, and the Wegman report to the US Congress in 2006 upheld their criticisms as valid and their arguments as compelling. The deficiencies in the IPCC process were given even wider publicity when hundreds of emails were either leaked or hacked on the University of East Anglia website in 2009, showing censorship and evidential irregularities. Professor Bob Carter lists 8 different recent scientific studies from 2000 to 2008 on proxy data, such as tree ring records, borehole temperature methods, and deep cores in glaciers, lake beds, and ocean floors, which demonstrate the existence of the medieval warming with temperatures equal to or higher than today. Particularly significant is the 2008 study by Lowley and McCulloch, compiled from 18 high-quality proxy climate records. Dr. Craig Idso has collected papers over the last quarter of a century from more than 1,000 scientists in 578 research institutions in 44 countries, providing evidence by a multitude of empirical methods that, taken together, establish that the medieval warm period was real, was global, and was warmer than the present. The comparatively few papers that oppose this evidence are written by a small, tight-knit group of computer modelers. The historical data are equally clear and sometimes more compelling on the existence of earlier and warmer times, followed by the Little Ice Age, a cold snap of 500 years. Two contrasting periods when the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere didn't change despite greatly differing temperatures worldwide. Brian Fagan is the best-known climate historian, author of a string of books and editor of the Oxford Companion to Archaeology. He believes in 20th century anthropogenic warming, but has no problem in accepting the evidence that in the medieval warm period, average summer temperatures were between 0.7 and 1 degree centigrade above 20th century averages, while Central European summers were up to 1.4 degrees centigrade higher. And some of the evidence. Commercial vineyards in England flourished 300 to 500 kilometres north of 20th century limits. So popular were English wines that the French tried to have their sale banned on the continent. In 1300, a farm owned by Kelso Abbey in southern Scotland had sheep and land under cultivation at 300 metres above sea level, well above today's limits. In Scandinavia and central Norway, farming spread 100 to 200 metres further up valleys and hillsides, and in this time forests in the Alps were between 80 to 200 metres higher than today. Bitter winters were a rarity. The warmer weather also allowed significant new colonisation. For 400 years, from about 800 to 1200, Vikings or Northmen from Scandinavia roamed European waterways, terrorising coastal areas. By 874, they'd settled permanently in Iceland. Now, Eric the Red was a violent and quarrelsome man who had to leave his home in southwestern Norway late in the 10th century because of some killings, and he sailed to Iceland where he married a local woman. Two more violent quarrels resulted in his banishment. An expert seaman, he confidently sailed west and reached southwestern Greenland, where he found better grazing. He called the country Greenland because he reasoned that an attractive name would bring more settlers, an early instance of climate spin. From Iceland, 25 ships of colonists sailed with him and 14 arrived to establish the eastern settlement in southwest Greenland. Another group went further north to found the western settlement, and these remained for nearly 400 years. A recent study sponsored by Brown University of core measurements taken from two lakes near the western settlement throw new light on its collapse in the mid-1300s, while the eastern settlement vanished in the first 2 decades of the 1400s. The study showed a temperature drop of 4 degrees Celsius from 1100 to 1180, which almost certainly caused shorter crop growing seasons and less available food for livestock. At least one Viking burial place still lies in the Greenland permafrost, and the medieval warming there remains as an inconvenient fact, an interesting backdrop to the foolish and mistaken claim in the newest edition of the Times Atlas of the World, which redefined 15% of Greenland's ice-covered land as green and ice-free. That had to be corrected. We also find milder and more pleasant examples of this warm time. Aelfric, a noted Anglo-Saxon preacher who died in 1010, was abbot of Aynsham near Oxford. In a homily for the first Sunday after Easter, he remarked in passing that we often saw silkworms that throughout the world make silk for all fine cloth. Obviously, it was consistently warm enough then, even in Oxford, for a continuing silkworm life cycle. And most importantly, the cold-sensitive beetle, Heterogaster urticae, was found in York in the High Middle Ages, but today is found only in the south of England. In 1135, the water flow in the Danube was so low that people could cross it on foot. Somewhat earlier, the Rhine had suffered the same fate. And then, against the run of things, around the middle of the Little Ice Age, the year 1540 was the warmest and driest for the millennium in Central Europe. And once again, the Rhine dried up. We can only imagine the excitement such events would provoke today. Western Europe thrived in the medieval warming, which saw the beginning of our great universities and the construction of many magnificent Gothic cathedrals. As the evidence for the medieval warming has increased, some of the exponents of AGW have conceded its existence in the northern hemisphere, but contested the claim that it extended south, despite the previously mentioned ITSO database. Once again, Brian Fagan has collected the scientific evidence from deep sea cores, pollen samples, tree rings, and Andean ice cores, and conclusively established the reality of an American medieval warming dominated by long and catastrophic droughts. The same centuries in the Americas witnessed severe drought, hunger, warfare in the north, and the collapse of two major civilizations in the south. For 10 centuries until 900, the Maya flourished in Central America, probably numbering 8 to 10 million people around 800. Climatologist David Hoddle began his research on sedimentary cores from salty Lake Chinacanab in the Yucatan in 1993. Continued work demonstrated a severe drought from 750 to 1025, which coincided with the Maya collapse of the southern lowlands. Different cities toppled in 810, 860, and finally around 900. The second example is Tiwanaku, a state of 50,000 people which flourished for 600 years in the first millennium and collapsed, leaving glorious ruins 15 kilometres east of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. A fine-grained ice core from the Calcaya ice cap high in the Andes, 200 kilometres away, show a dry period from 1040 to 1450. By 1150, the people of Tiwanaku had dispersed into small villages. The destruction of two civilizations after terrible droughts from the global warming of the Middle Ages overshadows even Eric the Red's colonial exploits, to say nothing of the Abbot of Eynsham silkworms. In conclusion, the continuing preeminence of the Western world depends on the continuing creative interaction which fueled the rise, the life-giving friction between the different forces symbolised by Athens, Rome, secular in this case, and Jerusalem. Whatever our political masters might decide of this high tide of Western indebtedness, they are increasingly unlikely, because of popular pressure, to impose new financial burdens on their populations in the hope of curbing the rise of global temperatures, except perhaps in Australia, which has 2% of the world's industrial capacity and 1.2% of its carbon dioxide emissions, while continuing to sell coal and iron every year worth billions of dollars to Asia. The debates about anthropogenic global warming can only be conducted on Athenian terms by the accurate recognition and interpretation of scientific evidence. And the evidence of historians is also vital, because this is not simply a mathematical problem, it's not pure science. Extreme weather events are to be expected, but are unexpected in every period. No one towards the end of the medieval warming in Europe expected the rapid descent into the cold and wet of the Little Ice Age, for example, or the freezing gales, winds and heavy rains that produced the short summers and the terrible developing famines of 1315 to 1320. Surprises such as these will continue into the future. For this reason, among others, I support the recommendation of John Lomberg and Bob Carter that rather than spending money on meeting the Kyoto Protocol, which would have produced an indiscernible effect on temperature rise, Money should be used to raise living standards and reduce the vulnerability to catastrophes and climate change in whatever direction, so helping people to cope better with future challenges. We need to be able to afford to provide the knowers of the future with the best arcs that science and technology can provide. In essence, this is the moral dimension to this issue. The cost of attempts to make global warming go away will be very heavy. They may be levied initially on the big polluters, but they will eventually trickle down to the end users. Efforts to offset the effect on the vulnerable are well-intentioned, but history tells us they can only ever be partially successful. Will the costs and the disruption be justified by the benefits? Before we can give an answer, there are some other scientific and economic questions that need to be addressed by governments and those advising them. As a layman in both fields, I don't pretend to have clear answers, but some others in the debate appear to be ignoring the questions and relying more on assumptions. What are the questions? They have to do with the validity of the assumptions and therefore the conclusions of the IPCC, and importantly the relationship of costs and benefits in both monetary and human terms. In other words, we must be sure the solutions being proposed are valid, the benefits are real, and the end result justifies the impositions on the community, particularly the most vulnerable. And you'll gather I've got concerns on all three fronts. Sometimes the very learned and clever can be brilliantly foolish, especially when seized by an apparently good cause. My request is for common sense and more, not less. What the medievals, following Aristotle, called prudence, one of the four cardinal virtues, the recta ratio agibilium, or right reason in doing things. We might call this a cost-benefit analysis, where costs and benefits are defined financially and morally or humanly, and their level of probability is carefully estimated. Are there any long-term benefits from the schemes to combat global warming, apart from extra tax revenues for governments and income for those devising and implementing the schemes? Will the burdens be shared generally or fall mainly on the shoulders of the battlers, the poor? Another useful Latin axiom is in dubio non agitur, don't act when in doubt. There is no precautionary principle, only the criteria for assessing what actions are prudent. When Galileo was placed under house arrest, primarily because of his claim that the earth moved around the sun, he is said to have muttered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. The earth is moving around the sun. As for Galileo, so for us. The appeal must be to the evidence, not to any consensus, whatever the levels of confusion or self-interested coercion. First of all, we need adequate scientific explanations as a basis for our economic estimates. We also need history, philosophy, even theology, and many will use, perhaps create, mythologies. But most importantly, we need to distinguish which is which. Thank you.